Hi, folks. Thank you for this opportunity to present when I couldn't make it to the live conference, but I hope to be with you next year so that we can have these discussions together. I've been working on a manuscript of the Quest of Bleheris from C.S. Lewis for about 9 years now, and I'd like to share one aspect of my discoveries from that manuscript. This manuscript is tucked into the Bodleian Library in Oxford in a book of actual letters, kind of like a scrapbook that's in the archive there. And we have left to us this lovely, beautifully scripted, what I believe to be a fine copy of a prose novel that C.S. Lewis attempted when he was 17 years old and shared with his friend. It's legible, but incomplete. There are almost 19,000 words, and it turns off at about chapter 17. Okay, the basic story, and for those that know C.S. Lewis's reading when he was young, is Arthurian or chivalrous. Bleheris is a 23-year-old knight living in the city of Nessus. In the courtly love tradition, he favors the Lady Alice. However, when Bleheris learns that his mother, Dame Foltette, has arranged his actual marriage with Alice, he's not actually exultant, but melancholic, for he hasn't really done any true deed as a knight. Following a time of contemplation, Bleheris decides to win honor and seek adventure before marrying. Lady Alice's father, Sir Lionel, provides knowledge of the road north for Bleheris, and the local priest, Father Ulfin, equips him with a protective flask of holy water. Bleheris sets out from his home, ascending the cloudy pass, going past the sunken wood, and arriving at the hostel of the Crossways. Now there, in adventure, Bleheris meets three men, Gers or Gers, the desirous, who desires for tomorrow and is in danger of being spilled upon the mothlight, the rock mothlight. Juan Jadis, who seeks after yesterday, he's in danger of being mired in visions of the past. And then Hyperides, he's a servant of Striver with some knowledge of men's hearts. Now, with these dangers and a threat of Betharel doom and a crisis with Lady Alice herself, Bleheris must learn to find his courage, how to choose his companions, choose his adventures well, and how to negotiate his devotion to Lady Alice and his faith in an ever-widening path before him. Now, the context of this story is when C.S. Lewis is doing his Three Greats period. It's 1916, and he's at Great Bookham in England under the tutor, the Great Knock, Kirkpatrick, and during the Great War. And he's studying to prepare to go up to Oxford to be a student, but also he knows he's on his pathway towards going into World War I, to the trenches. Some of this is captured within Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis's memoir, in chapters 9 to 11. And what we have here in a timeline is that in 1916, after returning after holidays, C.S. Lewis purchases that Fantastes volume by George MacDonald that changed his literary and religious life, and a couple of months later writes the beginning of Bleheris and sends letters weekly to his friend Arthur Greeves until the end of July. And then Lewis goes home to Belfast and takes a vacation in Port Salut, not far away in Ireland. And he ends up dropping the story at some point. He admits after going back for tutoring that Bleheris is dead. And then ultimately he goes up to Oxford and then the year later to the war. Okay. Now, what I want to do is place these things in some context. We now have Bleheris is now published within Sehnsucht Journal by Don King, and that'll be available hopefully by the end of this year as an open source. They're slowly opening those up now. And I want to use the research by Diana Pavlik-Glyer on creative collaboration, where she argued that contrary to the myth of the solitary genius, or the idea that C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and the other Inklings were kind of working in their little siloed rooms, Glyer argues that Lewis and Tolkien were deeply invested in creative collaborations because they were writers with diverse writerly skills, different mythic imaginations, literary tastes, academic backgrounds, and artistic vocations. And yet they come together in a group of influence, mutual influence, in certain kinds of roles, like resonators, where they support writerly progress, or opponents, where they challenge and offer feedback, editors, where they make literal drafts, edits on drafts, collaborators pulling together big projects, and then reference, talking about one another's work. Okay, now we can see this even before we have like the full manuscript of the Quest of Bleheris from 1916, because C.S. Lewis is talking about it in his letters to Arthur Greeves, which have been published. We have a lot of information that can already fit Diana Gleyer's pattern. C.S. Lewis is a resonator, full of encouragement, trying to get his friend Arthur Greeves to move forward, to make art, to write. We also see opponents. Lewis is always challenging Arthur, but we also see that Arthur challenges Lewis on the kind of presupposed atheist ideas in his work and in his letters, and that gives Lewis the chance to clarify and create that famous statement, religion is mythology, that reductive idea that he had as a youth, which has now become a platform for us to be able to understand that period, and that's because Arthur pushed him back on it. Editorially speaking, they don't do a ton of this. It's more the feedback thing, but there are some places where Arthur plays a deeper role in that process. But they were collaborators going to do projects together. Lewis wanted to write a mythic opera from a poem and was going to do the text, and Arthur was going to do the musical score, and then probably also the visual art as well. And then as reference, what we see is Arthur, within The Surprise by Joe, Arthur Greeves is the chief literary character for all kinds of things for Lewis, but especially the bonding over literary northernness or Nordic mythology. Lewis comes, meets Arthur while he's sick in bed. Arthur's reading a Norse myth book. Do you like that? Lewis says. Do you like that? Arthur says. And a friendship of imagination and sharing begins at that point. Okay, so that really works. And we can see actually as we go into the manuscript some more evidence of that. But first I just want to set it up because this manuscript is somewhat unique in the way that we have it, okay? So we have the concept of it here. It's in a book of letters, followed by other archival letters and pasted together by some archivist into this exhibit. So we don't have a manuscript deposit. What we actually have is a letter deposit. And so why is that? Well, that's because critical to Lewis's process when he was 17 writing this was his communication with Arthur Greeves. Okay, not only did he talk about ideas and kind of cover the different things, we can see that Lewis wrote in a 4-page booklet, the first 13 chapters of it, wrote in this little booklet, and then would copy it again, and then would send it to Arthur weekly throughout the summer of 1916. Okay, and then something changes. We can see the size of paper is relatively consistent, 4-page booklet. Then it goes to single sheets, single leaves, somewhere here in chapter 14 through the chapter 17, where it just ends. It's just Bleheris is dead and his muse is no more. Okay, so critical to this manuscript is the fact that it was mailed weekly to Arthur. That's absolutely essential to how we understand it. Okay, now within the manuscript, we're gonna see some marginalia and paratextual clues that are kind of interesting. The normal Bodleian ones are there, but we also see that Lewis wrote all of his chapter headings and things like that in pen, the same pen that he used for his manuscript, except for the last chapters where he has a pen and ink manuscript and then labels the work. The reason in pencil, the reason we think it's him rather than Arthur having done it, because they were together at the time, is because Lewis misnumbers the chapters, which is typical of him, which causes misnumbering within the archive itself when it's deposited. Okay. We also see cues within the script to Arthur in really kind of three kinds. One is looking for feedback or clarification. There's some sort of, Lewis gives the phrase, found the way over short, and then says still too short. I don't know what that means, but it's obviously an inside joke and some sort of feedback needed from Lewis. He also, with the same kind of cross or X, he also will highlight a word or something, I might not let thee, and then gives this comment at the bottom there with the same symbol. I suppose it's unnecessary to remind you that this word, let, in the old style means hinder. I shall not hinder thee. Okay, so we see that kind of signaling to Arthur, so feedback and giving him knowledge beyond the text itself. We see another kind of thing here that are connected. At one point, Lewis says in a header, try an illustration of scenery if you don't feel up to figures. At another point, when Lewis is describing something he's trying to capture in words, you see the little X here, and he says in the footer, I meant her, this character, to be like the picture of Hela in the story of Balder, your myths of the Norsemen. Okay? Now, in your myths of the Norsemen, what's key about that, really, is that's probably the book, or one very much like it, where they first met and first bonded over northernness. And now Lewis is trying to capture that within this chivalric, more Arthurian kind of context. So that's pretty cool, but we're staying with the collaboration thing, and we can see that Lewis is inviting Arthur to be a collaborator and providing him the kind of notes that an illustrator would need. We also see there's a handful of sketches on the manuscript itself, and these could have been done by Arthur or by Lewis, I suspect, because they're not very good. They're done by Lewis, although he wasn't a bad sketch artist, so I don't know for sure. It's also a similar pen. And we see here a landscape picture. We see Sir Bleheris going through the cloudy pass on his adventure. And we see here someone drowning, scribbled out, and then rot written over. So that's a self-evaluation. We actually see on the back page of this manuscript, we actually see a really intriguing combination of C.S. Lewis and Arthur Greeves, because we see Arthur Greeves' hand in three different segments on this back page. So here we actually see a sketch and then some hints of what to do. Blue for sky, gray, mountains perhaps, a path there. Maybe that's corn. I'm not sure. We also find actually a series of papers or books that they were discussing in their letters in 1916 as well. And we see a title page, Bleheris by CSL. My guess of the handwriting is that this is Arthur Greeves. And we kind of know that because here we see Arthur Greeves practicing his signature, as sometimes young folk do, and perhaps that's the best one. But you can see he's trying to work out the J and J Arthur. And so what we have here is a situation where Arthur pulled together a manuscript and created a situation where he added to it as he was experimenting with ideas and things like that. Now, what we have within this, within the evidence, is a series of things that speak to Lewis as a co-creator. Number one is we have a life pattern that Lewis creates. He and Arthur agree upon a 4-page letter scheme for letters. That's the right length, with not too long, not too short. Lewis ends up writing his chapters in that same 4-page quarto, and actually that forms a number of his patterns in life when it comes to word length and all kinds of interesting things. Lewis had a weekly pattern where he wrote the 4-page chapter on Sunday afternoons. He'd sketched it out in his mind, then sat down in his study to do it. Then he'd let it sit for a week or so and copy it out in fine, and then he would send that copy to Arthur by mail. Okay, so he gave a little bit of space between those things. So in this epistolary pattern, in letters and in person, Lewis is sharing with Arthur, but he's also inviting Arthur to be a collaborator, illustrator, critic, editor, all those things that Pavlik Lyer talks about. And we see this kind of co-creation pattern then work within Lewis and then out through life. So he used letters and probably in person to discuss with Arthur, not just like text and writing and challenges we might, but the deeper thing, the philosophical and artistic principles of the text itself. Now, going into the text, we can actually see a bit more information that's really cool on its own that we wouldn't see just from the paratextual or letters, that kind of thing. So we have this of the city of Nessus and certain that dwell there, and we have this little introduction where Lewis writes, "As I sate in the garden in summertime, when the sun had set and the first stars were trembling into light, and while the ghostly little bats were bleating above me, it came to me in mind to write for you, Galahad, somewhat of the life and dealings of this Bleheris. For, in my conceit, since he was surely not unlike yourself, it seemed that you might have pleasure in hearing of his life and his death that fell so many years ago. Know then that in the old days, when this world was still young and full of wonders, ... Okay, so this is the setup to this book, and this is intriguing on a number of levels. First, we see here in Lewis's poetry from 1915 to 1919 until his first book of lyric poetry was published, Spirits in Bondage, we see a number of references that have been worked out in poems, but also those poems were kept in manuscript form, pre-manuscript form, various drafts, and ultimately a collection, Meditations of a Cod, or on a Cod, that Arthur was the one who kept that manuscript in case Lewis died in war. And so Arthur's a part of that. It's not just epistolary, but Arthur's the curator in the sense of C.S. Lewis's self-edited work. We also see that Lewis, in this text, the narrator, presumably Lewis, but the narrator in the text, the fictional character narrating the story, is a friend with Galahad. That's an Arthurian name, but it's also the name that Lewis gave to Arthur, his friend, Arthur Greeves, because he was like so chaste when he was young. That they dropped that later, but there's in the letters of this period and then in this text, Lewis is writing to Galahad, and it's also very personal. Bleheris is like Galahad, presumably like Arthur Greeves, and they share together this fictional world, which is sort of two echoes after Arthur. So there's the Arthurian world, then Bleheris's world, and there's a bit of fading there away from the Arthurian principles, and then the world that the narrator and Galahad share. That's a second kind of fading. The wonders are gone, but the stories are still there. Now, what's really intriguing about that is that double layering primary secondary world thing, where Arthur's the primary world, Galahad in letters and my friend in the secondary tale. So Arthur's a receiver of the letters, so in that sense the prime audience, and a character in the story who's a receiver of the story itself. Okay, so primary world, we have Lewis, the writer, and Arthur, the receiver, but he's also critic, illustrator, resonator, collaborator, ultimately curator. And then we have the secondary world inside. Lewis and narrator are together with Galahad, a receiver. And see, there's a collaborative moment that's happening at both levels, and both levels are epistolary. The text itself in the secondary world is an epistle, a journal, a letter, a story of sorts, and then also it came in epistolary form. In fact, this collaborative connection in the secondary world so deep that Lewis is playful and maybe confuses things sometimes. So had our good friend, spelt wrongly, friend Jane Austen been there, she had painted cunningly the soul of Dame Foltette, but it's such a matter's too excellent for me. Lewis Lewis, narrator, Galahad, Arthur, receiver are in a sense in the fictional world that exists with Jane Austen in the same kind of way that, the Bastable Children and Sherlock exist in the first layer of secondary worlds in The Magician's Nephew and the Narniad. Okay, now we also see through the text and the writing, there's this phatic function. Check, are you there? Are you hearing me? We see a bunch of self-doubt in the writing, things like, if you care to hear me, or this is too excellent for me, or things like that. There's this shared kind of, we have this deep books, and unless you can see it live again, you won't understand. This is a principle of C.S. Lewis's writing in that second quotation. And this final quotation, and now my Galahad, don't be wroth, probably, with him, if I shew you for a while his thoughts upon that night, for I trust that both he and you and I shall all have won to greater manhood before the tale be ended. And this is critical to what Lewis was doing. That is the thesis statement of the moral side of his artistic project in this period. Okay, and he includes Arthur in that. They're all on the road. Bleheris, Arthur, and Lewis are on the road together as people trying to deepen their honor, deepen their deeds, deepen their humanity, deepen their manhood. Now, we can see how this fits back into those patterns that we talked about earlier on those different things, but the text has added these different things. We see as resonators that there's this mutual encouragement that's going on, but also the emphatic function in the text where Lewis is seeking from Arthur something, but we also see him confessing to Arthur when it's done. Bleheris is dead, he killed my muse. We see feedback and challenge. We see in the text itself that Lewis is clarifying, looking for editorial work. We see he's looking for the illustrator collaboration, but he's looking for something deeper. I mean, Arthur's signature is literally on this manuscript, right? It's there. And then when it comes to reference, we don't have Greeves, much of Greeves' personal papers, although his diaries of the period are very much about C.S. Lewis in a lot of ways. But we do have Greeves' own life. We have this manuscript, this gorgeous manuscript, because Arthur Greeves kept the Great Bookham era letters, which made up chapters 1 to 13, and he took Lewis's unfinished Irish drafts from him, bundled them, preserved them, and donated from posterity. Because this is kind of the intriguing puzzle. The first 13 chapters are all tight, and then those final 4, it looks like Lewis went to Ireland, Port Salut, was with Arthur, and the thing fell apart. And Lewis might have tossed away the papers, but Arthur grabs them, holds them, and ultimately we have them in the archive because of him. Now, everything points to these things. Arthur was critical to Lewis's intellectual, social, literary, and religious development. I think we knew that already. From his earliest years, Lewis believed that the creative process was collaborative and communal. And you will know that if you've read carefully through the letters and Lewis's diary of the 20s, but it's harder to see. This manuscript and the whole series together adds a whole layer of that, both in the primary world of two friends in Great Britain, and then in the secondary world of two friends following another figure within an Arthurian type story. Intriguingly, the story stops when Lewis and Greeves are together. So collaboration works only when, at that time, when it's in this epistolary pattern of sending and receiving at both those levels. When they're together, something fails, something falls apart. And Lewis needed the weekly process and the habits of mind and the epistolary connection to make it work. By his adulthood, that would move on. Lewis is able to work in collaboration in multiple layers. But what this shows us, what this gorgeous manuscript shows us, is that so deeply within Lewis's framework is the rejection of the original genius and the building of this idea, much like the medieval cathedral, reusing stones of other artists into something new. Lewis has that built into him, even young, even when he has a kind of literary arrogance and he's experimental and he's a bit sassy and he's preparing for war and he can't learn math, but he's doing super well and everything else. In all that context, we see a lifelong pattern of subcreation that is shared, communal, and expressive within the originality that only relationship can create. And we see that in all levels of the text itself, the paratextual evidence, the epistolary realities around it, and Lewis's memoirs reflecting back on this moment, confirmed by scholarship. So thank you for your time. Feel free to dialogue by email or through social media or something. And I can not share the pictures in this slide deck, but I'll share anything that I can with you to help get to this great text. Take care.